Welcome, and thanks for tuning in. In this video, I'll be going draft by draft through my process of rewriting the metaphor in the opening scene of Amazon's new TV show, The Rings of Power, so that I can touch on a few writing techniques used throughout. If you want to hear my dissection of the original metaphor, and why I felt compelled to rewrite both it as well as the scene within which it was spoken, then check out my earlier video on that. Links in the description below. But what I want this channel to focus on is writing craft, and less so commentary, so that's what I'll be doing here. My intention is to help aspiring writers, like yourself, learn the fundamentals of prose in the hopes of lessening the urge you may have to slam your head repeatedly against your keyboard. Believe me, I've been there. Note that it wasn't the prose I took issue with in the original. They were fine. It was more so that the metaphor didn't make any sense. So let's jump into it. I'll read the fifth and final draft of the metaphor I wrote in its place so that we can move on to the writing process itself. Do you know why that stone sunk your ship? Because it's a rock, and my ship only parchment. Yes, but do you know why it struck it? Galadriel hesitates. Because your ship was trapped in the current's grip. When that stone flew overhead, the ship felt its shadow looming, but carried on, helpless, overwhelmed by the rapids beneath its hull, for it had no sails of its own. Its position downstream was destined, and so named through his rock, and sunk it. There are many currents in this world, sister, the darkest, most relentless in their pull. And should you abide by any and all, never to sail a path your own, one day you may feel the shadow of a thrown stone, and be helpless but to drift, and pray it misses. But a person can't swim upriver forever. They'll get tired. How do I know when to ride the current, and when to fight it? You listen to your heart. But that seems so simple. The most important truths often are. To be clear, I'm not analyzing this piece of writing to entertain some grand illusion that it's a masterwork scholars will be fawning over for centuries to come, but simply because it's a useful example. If I were looking to include this piece in a work I sought to get published, there's some things I'd touch up, but I think there's more than a few techniques in here worth unpacking. So let's go ahead and look at the first draft, so I can show you how a piece of writing like this starts off. Do you know why the stone struck your ship? Because your ship was merely traveling with the current, and could not change course. When the stone flew overhead, the ship sensed its shadow, but pulled by the current it was helpless to change course, for it had no sails of its own. The stone's shadow loomed, blocked out the sun, and knowing where the current would drag your ship, it crashed down and sunk it. There are many currents in this world, sister, and their pull is strong, but follow them and you'll never sail a path your own. And should a rock one day come soaring overhead, you'll be helpless to do anything but hope that it misses. But what if the shadow overhead is just a cloud? How do you know shade from darkness? You listen to your heart. But that seems so simple. The most important truths often are. Now, as you may well see, there's some fat to be trimmed and phrasing to be honed. So let's compare this first draft side by side with the second, so I can begin to show you how I refine my prose. Right off the bat, I added some back and forth in the beginning, because it seemed strange to me that young Galadriel wouldn't have thrown an answer at the first question her brother posed, especially a question with such an obvious answer. Remember, these are two people speaking with each other, not just saying lines. Next, you'll notice I wrote name here, and this is just a placeholder I use when I'm writing and don't want to think of a name just yet, or in this case, ever. I'd recommend doing this for minor characters so your flow doesn't get disrupted while writing the first draft of your story. I even do this for things like trees if the species is unknown, generic objects if their material is unknown, physical character traits like hair and eye color, and so on. Then I changed traveling with the current to in the grips of the current, just a bit stronger language. The word traveling implies it has a choice. It's still a passive sentence, because I'm saying your ship was in the grips of the current, as opposed to saying the current gripped your ship. But since I'm not writing the scene where this action is taking place, rather a scene where one character is simply describing to another something that has already happened, I'm content to keep it in its passive form. Now, looking at the third sentence, note that I start off with the same general structure, writing, when the stone flew overhead, the ship sensed its shadow, but, before summarizing the rest with carried on, to make it more concise. In most cases, being more concise, that is, saying the same thing using fewer words, leads to stronger prose. Just be careful you don't use too few. Then, after carried on, I proceeded to use more powerful language to convey why the boat carried on. I used a strong word like overwhelmed, and changed it was helpless to just helpless. Oftentimes, if the reader already knows what object you're referring to, in this case the paper boat, you can simply replace the it was with a comma or two. This also removes the passive sound, a common form of which is noun was verb or noun was adjective, as opposed to the active, which often takes the form noun verb noun. This change also makes it more concise. I then use a specific word like hull, because this is the specific part of the ship that the water is in contact with. Being specific is also one of the keys to stronger prose. You don't say tree, you say oak. And you don't say fabric if the character knows it's linen. You'll notice I ended up keeping the line, for it had no sails of its own, all the way into the fifth and final draft. This is what I call a statement sentence, because there are no ands or buts or thens. It simply states something that is true, or that the character believes to be true. These are great for resetting the cadence, or rhythm, of the prose if it ever starts to feel repetitive. The word for is also a good replacement for because if you're going for a grander or more sophisticated tone. Just don't overuse it. Next, I added the word always to the sentence, but follow them always and you'll never sail a path your own, to be clear that sometimes you follow the currents and sometimes you don't, even though I still wasn't in love with this wording at the time. Remember, this is just my thought process you're seeing. The rest is pretty much unchanged, so let's go ahead and compare the second draft to the third. First off, I changed yes, that is true to yes, this is true, because it sounds a bit more formal and sophisticated, and this is an elf speaking after all. I then changed the second line again from your ship was in the grips of the current to your ship was trapped in the current's grip, because trapped is a verb that added a little punch and a sense of hopelessness, and in this case, current's grip sounded better to me than grips of the current. It's more concise this way, eliminating 2 words, but then again, it also adds an apostrophe, which I also tend to avoid. The option to replace of the by apostrophizing the object of the sentence, current in this case, comes up fairly often, and I tend to go with whichever sounds better in that particular instance. I also got rid of and could not change course, because this is redundant information that is already implied in the following sentences. I changed sensed its shadow to felt its shadow, just sounded a touch more visceral, and then I got rid of the stone's shadow loomed, blocked out by the sun, because I had already mentioned the shadow, so at this point this information was redundant. You'll find that weeding out redundant information is a big part of making your prose more concise, and remember, conciseness is key. Next, I changed water flowing with rapids, a much stronger word, I think you'll agree. I then changed, but follow them always, to, but abide by them, because this is a wise elf speaking, and abide sounded a touch deeper and more foreboding. However, the sentence is still in a bit of a flux right now, because it's now lacking the always bit again, which I was struggling to tie in a way that sounded nice. All things in good time. Next, I changed come soaring overhead to soar overhead to be more concise and active. You'll find that using a lot of verbs that end with ing, in this case, soaring, is often a sign of writing in a passive voice. I then added the bit about folding your hands in prayer, because I thought it would sound a bit more visceral and would conjure an image in the reader's mind. The rest I left the same, so let's move on to the fourth draft. The first change here is and so, as opposed to just and, because it sets up the sentence a little better. I still didn't like the break it caused in the cadence of the prose very much, but left it there for the time being. I also changed the context here, from the rock crashing down and sinking the ship to the boy throwing it. Recall from my earlier video how I didn't like associating willful action with rock. I did this by replacing the rock crashed with name through. I then broke up the next sentence into 2, and specified that it's the dark currents that are often the strongest, to add a bit of moral weight to what he's saying. And I used a strong word like relentless to really hammer that home. I then went on to say, abide by any and all, to fix what was bugging me earlier, because the metaphor isn't about always going against the current, but knowing when to, so I had to specify that abiding by all currents is what is undesirable. Remember, above all, your writing has to convey your thought or idea as accurately as possible. Always prioritize accuracy and truth over eloquence. You don't want nice-sounding nonsense. I also repeated the word shadow here, so that the listener would know what Shadow Galadriel's question is referring to. Granted, I later ended up changing her question, so this became unnecessary. You may be starting to notice the back and forth of the writing process. I then shortened fold your hands in prayer to pray to make it more concise. Here, I prioritized conciseness over painting a visual picture because of how long and jumbled the sentence was getting. When writing, you must constantly make these types of decisions and prioritize one thing over another. The instances I prioritize something over conciseness are few, and most often have to do with characterizing my prose to a particular character's voice or to convey distress or some similar emotion. Next, I rewrote her question to be a lot more specific. Note the cadence trick I use here. I am asking 2 questions, and so each sentence is broken into 2 parts by a comma with an and after it. This is a desirable form of repetition. How do I know it's desirable? Well, because it sounds nice. It flows. You don't always have to think so technically when writing. I certainly wasn't aware that I did this while I was writing it. It just sounded nice. But I think it's good to look for these patterns. Whenever you like the sound of something, analyze it and ask why. And do the same if you don't like the sound of something. See if you can figure it out. It's a shame I didn't get to keep the question this way, because I quite liked it. I changed it for reasons pertaining to the metaphor's meaning. Again, I prioritized accuracy over eloquence. Your writing must make sense, first and foremost, and convey what you're trying to convey. Eloquence comes second. Again, refer to my earlier video if you care to know the specific reasons for these types of changes. The rest of this draft stays the same, so let's return to the 5th and final draft, where I'm focused almost entirely on polishing the language and the cadence. The scaffolding here is already built. First off, I altered the initial back and forth to make it a little more poetic. These are elves speaking, after all, and it gives her brother the opportunity to specify that he's not asking her why a rock sunk her paper boat, but why it struck it in the first place. Having Galadriel hesitate upon an initial exchange also makes a little more sense, as opposed to the original, where she hesitates upon being asked why a ship floats and a stone cannot, as if she didn't already know. This comma I put after looming could go either way. It depends on the rhythm you're going for. Next, I moved the and so to after the comma because I felt having it start that way disrupted the cadence of the sentence. I then added the word destined so that the listener understands that having no sails of your own in this metaphor is akin to having destiny taken out of your hands. Again, always hone in as much as possible on what specifically you're trying to say. Next, I added the word drift to give a visual cue to the listener. It also specifies that being helpless in this situation is akin to drifting with the current. The comma after drift then helps to slow the cadence down and give a little more punch to the words that come after. Always read your prose out loud if you're wondering which way works better. I then rewrote her question, because once more I was confronted by the fact that any use of words like darkness and light just conflicted with the plot. It was at this point I began to realize why using a metaphor to tie together the opening and ending scenes of this episode was foolhardy, which is why I ended my earlier video by rewriting the opening scene to replace the use of metaphor entirely. And there we have it, my metaphor's final form. I touched on several techniques here, including passive versus active voice, being concise, being specific, and using strong words. But if you ever found yourself lost, or something I said unclear, fear not, for I'll be making dedicated videos for each of these techniques in the future. Stay tuned for that. And comment below any prose questions of your own. Or, if you want me to edit some of your own writing, and don't mind me turning the process into a video, feel free to send me some. Until next time.